She's the daughter we declared dead 20 years ago." Those were the words Judge Harrison whispered to his clerk when I walked into that Cleveland courtroom to testify against my father. The room went silent. Every head turned. My father's face drained of all color. But here's what they didn't know. For 2 decades, I've been carrying a faded stuffed rabbit in my purse, the only proof I once existed as Catherine Brennan. That night, alone in my hotel room, I held that rabbit and cried for the little girl who was erased from every record, every memory, every family photo. My name is Kate, and this is the story of how a legal death certificate, a courtroom gasp, and 20 years of silence taught everyone in that room what it means to truly see someone. Before I tell you how a ghost came back to haunt her own father, subscribe and share this story with someone who knows what it's like to feel invisible in plain sight. And please, comment below telling me what city you're watching from. I love connecting with survivors from all over the world. What happened that day in court changed everything, because sometimes the most powerful testimony comes from someone who was never supposed to speak again. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the brass handle of the courtroom door. It was October 12th, 2024, exactly 20 years and 3 months since the state of Ohio had declared Catherine Marie Brennan legally dead. I remember standing in that marble hallway of the Cleveland County Courthouse, my fingertips pressed against the cold metal, feeling the weight of the stuffed rabbit in my coat pocket like it was made of lead instead of worn cotton and faded memories. The rabbit's ear poked against my ribs with every breath I took, a small sharp reminder that I was still here, still breathing, still real despite what every legal document in existence said about me. How does a dead girl walk into a courtroom? That's the question everyone would ask later, but standing there in that moment, the question burning through my mind was simpler and more terrifying. How does a dead girl find the courage to face the man who killed her without ever laying a hand on her? The hallway smelled like floor polish and fear, that particular scent that courthouses have, the smell of justice mixed with desperation. I could hear muffled voices through the heavy wooden doors, the low rumble of the judge's voice, someone coughing, the shuffle of papers. My father was in there. Richard Brennan, the man whose DNA I carried, whose last name I was born with, whose face I couldn't remember clearly anymore because I'd spent 2 decades trying to forget it. I pressed my palm flat against the door and felt my pulse hammering against the wood. The security guard at the end of the hall was watching me with concern, probably wondering if I was going to faint or run. I wanted to do both. My lawyer, Patricia Chun, had told me that morning over burnt coffee in a diner across the street that I didn't have to do this, that my written testimony would be enough, that showing my face wasn't required. But she didn't understand. This wasn't about legal requirements. This was about a little girl who'd been erased, who'd been forgotten, who'd been declared dead while she was still breathing in a foster home 3 counties away. This was about Catherine Brennan finally getting to stand up and say, "I'm here. I existed. You don't get to pretend I never was." I touched the rabbit through my coat, feeling the familiar shape of its body, the missing button eye, the torn seam on its left foot. I'd found this rabbit in a donation box at my 3rd foster home when I was 9 years old, 1 year after my father had abandoned me at a group home and disappeared. The rabbit had a tag that said Catherine written in child's handwriting on the inside of its ear. My handwriting. My rabbit. The only object that had survived from before, the only proof that I had once been a real girl with a real name in a real house. Every foster home I'd lived in, every strange bed I'd slept in, every social worker who'd shuffled me from place to place, that rabbit had come with me. When I discovered at 15 years old that I'd been declared legally dead, when I'd seen my own death certificate in the county records, when I'd realized my father had reported me as deceased to collect life insurance and close out my existence like I was a canceled subscription, I'd held that rabbit and sobbed until I couldn't breathe. And now, standing outside this courtroom door with my hand trembling on the handle and my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest, that rabbit was the only thing keeping me standing. Through the door, I heard the bailiff call the next witness. That was me, Kate Morrison, formerly Catherine Brennan, formerly deceased. I took one breath, then another. My fingers tightened on the handle. Somewhere in my pocket, the rabbit's fabric ear pressed against my side like a tiny hand holding mine. How did a dead girl walk into court? One step at a time, carrying the only witness who'd never stopped believing she was alive. I was 6 years old the first time my father taught me how to fish. We drove out to Miller's Creek in his old pickup truck, the one with the broken radio and the smell of sawdust permanently embedded in the seats. He worked construction back then, before the business deals and the money, and whatever it was that eventually turned him into someone I didn't recognize. I remember sitting in that truck with my legs too short to reach the floor, watching the Ohio countryside blur past the window, counting red barns because he'd promised me an ice cream cone for every 10 I spotted. He'd laughed when I'd gotten to 73, his hand ruffling my hair while he said I'd bankrupted him in dairy products. The creek was shallow and cold that morning, and I'd been terrified of putting the worm on the hook. My father had knelt down beside me in the mud, his calloused hands covering mine, showing me how to thread the hook through without flinching. "You can't be afraid of what makes you uncomfortable, Katie Bear," he'd said. "That's how you survive in this world. You do the hard things, even when they make you squeamish." I'd caught a tiny sunfish that day, no bigger than my palm, and he'd acted like I'd landed a whale. We'd taken a photo on his disposable camera, me holding up that ridiculous little fish with both hands, grinning so wide my face hurt, my father's arm around my shoulders. I wonder what happened to that photo. Probably thrown away with everything else that proved I'd existed. Sunday mornings were pancake mornings in our house. My father would wake me up at 7, and we'd tiptoe downstairs trying not to wake my mother, who'd worked night shifts at the hospital and needed sleep more than she needed family breakfast. He'd let me crack the eggs, even though I always got shells in the bowl, and he'd make Mickey Mouse shapes with the batter while I sat on the counter swinging my legs and telling him about my imaginary friend Margaret, who lived in the backyard oak tree. He never told me Margaret wasn't real. He'd set a place for her at the table, a tiny plate with a tiny pancake, and he'd ask me to pass along his regards. Those mornings smelled like butter and maple syrup and safety. They smelled like belonging to someone. My father had a workshop in the garage where he'd build things on weekends. Birdhouses, mostly. Small wooden structures with hand-painted details and tiny perches. He'd let me help, handing me sandpaper and showing me how to smooth the rough edges, how to follow the grain of the wood. His hands were always gentle when he taught me things, patient in a way that made me feel capable of anything. We'd painted a birdhouse together once, blue and yellow with white trim, and he'd help me write my name on the bottom in careful block letters. Catherine Marie Brennan. His greatest creation, he called me, kissing the top of my head. Better than any birdhouse I'll ever build. I believed him. God, I believed every word. There was a birthday party when I turned 7. Nothing fancy, just a few kids from school in our backyard, a store-bought cake with pink frosting, a banner my father had hung between 2 trees. He'd carried me on his shoulders that whole afternoon, me squealing with laughter every time he'd pretend to stumble. My mother had taken videos on the camcorder, her rare smile visible in the reflection of the lens. I'd blown out the candles and wished for nothing because I'd thought I already had everything. How do you reconcile those memories with what came after? How do you hold the image of a man who made you pancakes and taught you about fishing and called you his greatest creation next to the image of a man who abandoned you at a group home and declared you dead for insurance money? That's the question that had haunted me for 20 years. Standing in that courtroom hallway, my hand still on the door, I'd realized something. I didn't need to reconcile them. They were both true. He'd been that father once. And then he became someone else. People contain multitudes, my therapist had told me. They can love you and destroy you with the same hands that taught you how to bait a hook. It was a Tuesday in March when my father drove me to Riverside Group Home and told me to wait in the lobby while he talked to someone about paperwork. I was 8 years old and carrying a grocery bag with 3 days' worth of clothes because he'd said we were visiting a friend. The lobby smelled like disinfectant and old carpet, and there were plastic chairs bolted to the floor in rows like a waiting room at the DMV. I sat in one of those chairs swinging my legs, watching a water-stained ceiling tile that looked like it might fall at any moment. My father had been different for months by then. Distant. His eyes would slide past me at the dinner table like I was furniture. The pancake mornings had stopped. The workshop stayed locked. He'd started coming home late with alcohol on his breath and papers in his hands that he'd spread across the kitchen table, muttering numbers under his breath, while my mother watched him with this look I didn't understand yet. Fear mixed with resignation. The look of someone watching a car crash in slow motion. That morning, he hadn't said much during the drive. Just told me to pack some clothes. We were going somewhere for a few days. My mother had been at work. I remember asking him if we were going fishing again, and he'd said no. Not fishing, just something he needed to take care of. His hands had been tight on the steering wheel, knuckles white, jaw clenched like he was chewing on something bitter. I'd sat in that lobby for 45 minutes before a woman with tired eyes and a clipboard came out and knelt in front of me. Her name tag said Sharon. She'd asked me my name, my age, if I knew why I was there. I told her I was waiting for my dad, that he was talking to someone about paperwork. She'd looked at me with something that might have been pity or might have been exhaustion from seeing too many kids like me. "Sweetie," she'd said, "your dad explained the situation to us. You're going to be staying here for a little while." I'd laugh because obviously she was confused. My dad wouldn't leave me in a place that smelled like bleach and sadness. He was probably in the bathroom or making a phone call. I told her there was a mistake. She'd squeezed my shoulder and told me there wasn't. The moment I understood what was happening felt like falling through ice. That sudden cold shock when your brain can't process what your body already knows. I'd run to the front door, still clutching my grocery bag, and looked out the glass panel to the parking lot. His truck was gone. The space where he'd parked was empty except for an oil stain on the concrete. I'd pressed my face against that glass until Sharon gently pulled me away, my breath fogging up the window, my hands leaving small prints on the surface. He'd driven away, while I'd been sitting in that plastic chair counting ceiling tiles. When did I stop being his daughter? Was it that morning when he'd told me to pack a bag? Was it weeks before when he'd stopped looking at me during dinner? Was it the moment his business started failing and he'd needed to cut losses, and apparently I was a loss worth cutting? Or had it been gradual? So slow I hadn't noticed him disappearing from my life until the day he made me disappear from his. Sharon had taken me to a room with 4 beds and told me to pick one. The other girls barely looked up when I walked in. One was reading a book with a torn cover. Another was staring at the wall. The third was younger than me, maybe 6, clutching a stuffed animal I couldn't quite see in the dim light. I put my grocery bag on the bed closest to the window and sat down on the thin mattress. Through the glass I could see the parking lot, the street beyond it, the direction his truck had gone. I'd sat there until dinner time, waiting for him to come back and tell me it was all a misunderstanding. That night, lying in that unfamiliar bed listening to strange girls breathe in the darkness, I'd finally understood. Dads who come back don't leave their daughters in places with bolted-down chairs and clipboard ladies named Sharon. Dads who come back don't drive away while you're counting ceiling tiles. I was 8 years old, and I just learned that love has an expiration date, and mine had apparently passed without anyone telling me. Visitation day at Riverside Group Home was every other Sunday from 2 to 4 in the afternoon. The common room would fill with parents carrying grocery store flowers and guilty expressions, grandmothers with Tupperware containers of homemade cookies, siblings who'd been separated by the system hugging each other like they might never let go. I spent 6 visitation days sitting in the corner by the payphone, watching the door, waiting for my mother to walk through it. She never did. The other kids learned to stop asking me if anyone was coming. By the 4th Sunday, even Sharon had stopped giving me that pitying look when she'd call out names for visitors, and mine was never on the list. I'd watch a girl named Amanda, whose mother brought her new school supplies every visit, watch them sit at the table by the window going through notebooks and pencils like they were treasure. I'd watch Marcus, whose grandmother would braid his sister's hair in the corner, her gnarled fingers moving with practiced gentleness while she hummed something that sounded like a lullaby. And I'd wonder what I'd done that was so terrible my own mother couldn't even manage 2 hours every other week. The payphone on the wall became my obsession. Sharon had given me a calling card with 30 minutes on it, told me I could use it to call family if I needed to. I'd memorized my home phone number, had practiced what I'd say when my mother answered. "Mom, it's me, Katie. Please come get me. I'm sorry for whatever I did. I'll be better." I called on a Wednesday evening during free time, my hands shaking so badly I could barely punch in the numbers. The phone rang 4 times before she picked up. I'd heard her voice, that familiar tired sound, and I'd opened my mouth to speak. Then I'd heard my father in the background. His voice, sharp and commanding. "Who is it?" And my mother had paused for just a second too long before she'd said wrong number and hung up. She'd known it was me. I'd heard the recognition in that pause, the moment of decision, the choice she'd made. I'd stood there holding that receiver until the dialed tone became a harsh beeping, and Sharon had gently taken it from my hand. I tried twice more over the following weeks. Same result. Once she'd let it ring until the machine picked up. Once she'd answered and I'd heard her breathing on the other end, heard her knowing I was there, heard her silence stretching between us like an ocean, before she'd quietly disconnected. That's when I'd understood something Sharon would later confirm during one of our mandatory counseling sessions. My mother had signed papers, voluntary relinquishment of parental rights. My father had convinced her it was the best thing, that they couldn't afford me anymore, that the business was failing and they needed to focus on survival. He'd probably told her it was temporary, that they'd come back when things got better. But Sharon had seen the paperwork. Nothing about it was temporary. My mother had put her signature on a document that erased me from their family as legally as if I'd never been born. Your mother chose silence over you, Sharon had said, not unkindly, just factually. She was trying to help me understand, so I'd stop waiting by that payphone. Some people aren't strong enough to fight. They choose the path of least resistance, even when that path goes through their own child's heart. I'd wanted to hate her. God, I tried to hate her. But mostly I'd felt sorry for her, which somehow hurt worse. My mother was a woman who'd worked night shifts her entire adult life, who'd married a man with big dreams and bigger debts, who'd learned early that speaking up meant getting shut down. She'd been taught that survival meant staying quiet, keeping your head low, not making waves even when those waves were drowning your own daughter. I'd seen her, really seen her, maybe for the first time. Not as the mother who should have saved me, but as another woman who'd been erased by my father in her own way. He'd been erasing women his whole life, making us disappear while we were still standing right in front of him. My mother had just gotten a different kind of death certificate than mine. Hers was called a marriage license. Years later, when I built my new life as Kate Morrison, I'd understood something Sharon couldn't have known she was teaching me that day. The women in my family had a pattern. We loved men who made us disappear. My grandmother had loved a man who'd left her with 5 kids and a mortgage. My mother had loved a man who'd asked her to give up her daughter. And somewhere in my bones, I'd carried that same pattern, that same belief that love meant making yourself smaller until you vanished completely. But sitting in that courtroom hallway 20 years later, my hand on the door, the rabbit in my pocket, I'd made a different choice. I was about to walk in there and become the first woman in my family who refused to disappear. The Thompson house smelled like cat urine and instant coffee. That was my second placement after Riverside, 3 months after my father had dropped me off and vanished. Mrs. Thompson was a widow who took in foster kids for the monthly checks, kept us fed on generic brand cereal and government cheese, barely learned our names before we cycled out to the next placement. I lasted 4 months there. I remember the bedroom I shared with 2 other girls, the wallpaper peeling in strips near the ceiling, the single window that overlooked a parking lot where teenagers would gather at night to smoke and blast music from car stereos. I'd lie awake listening to bass lines vibrate through the walls, clutching the rabbit I'd found, whispering my real name into its fabric ear so I wouldn't forget who I was. Catherine Marie Brennan. Katie Bear. The girl who'd caught a sunfish and eaten Mickey Mouse pancakes. The Rodriguez family came next. They were kind, genuinely kind, which somehow made it worse. Maria Rodriguez would pack lunches with little notes tucked inside, hearts drawn in the margins, messages in Spanish that I'd use a library dictionary to translate. Her husband Santos worked nights at a factory, and days he'd teach me how to fix bikes in their garage, his patient hands showing me how to true a wheel, how to adjust brake cables. They had 3 biological kids who treated me like a temporary sister, polite but distant, already understanding I wouldn't stay. I wanted to stay. God, I wanted to stay so badly it physically hurt. But the system had other plans, something about overcrowding and age-appropriate placements, and 6 months later I was packing my garbage bag of belongings again. Maria had cried when the social worker came. I hadn't. I'd learned by then that crying changed nothing. At the Hendersons' house, I had my own room for the first time in 2 years. A small space under the stairs that reminded me of Harry Potter, if Harry Potter's cupboard had smelled like mildew and had a ceiling so low you couldn't stand up straight. But it was mine. I taped drawings to the walls, pictures I'd made at school of houses that didn't exist and families I'd invented. Mr. Henderson had a temper that came out after his 3rd beer, never physical but loud enough that I'd learned to make myself invisible during dinner, to eat quickly and disappear to my cupboard before he'd find something to yell about. Mrs. Henderson would apologize with her eyes, that same look my mother used to have, that helpless expression of a woman who'd chosen her survival over someone else's safety. I'd lasted 11 months there before they decided fostering wasn't for them. The Jefferson house, the Kowalski apartment, the Chin family townhouse. The names and faces started to blur together by the time I was 12. Different kitchens with the same linoleum floors. Different bedrooms with the same thin mattresses and scratchy blankets. Different families with the same underlying message. You're here, but you're not ours. I'd learned to pack my garbage bag in under 10 minutes. I'd learned which belongings mattered and which could be left behind. I'd learned to sleep in new beds without crying, to navigate new schools without making friends I'd have to leave, to answer when people called me Catherine, even though the name was starting to feel like a costume that didn't fit anymore. The rabbit came with me through all of it. That ridiculous stuffed animal with the missing button eye and the name tag inside its ear. It became a ritual before bed in each new place. I'd press my thumb against that tag, feel the indentation of my childhood handwriting, remind myself that I'd been real once, that I hadn't always been this ghost floating through temporary homes and borrowed families. At Lincoln Heights Youth Center, which was really just a glorified warehouse for teenagers the system had given up on, I'd met a girl named Shanice who'd been in care since she was 4. She was 15, same as me, with eyes that had seen too much and a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. We'd shared cigarettes stolen from staff members, compared horror stories of placements, made dark jokes about the system that neither of us could actually escape. She'd asked me once why I kept that ratty rabbit, why I didn't just throw it away and get something new. Because it's the only thing that knows my real name, I told her. Everything else is a lie. 7 years of searching for something I couldn't name. 7 years of temporary addresses and temporary families and temporary versions of myself. 7 years of caseworkers with kind smiles and exhausted eyes telling me the next placement would be better, more stable, more permanent. 7 years of learning that permanent was a word adults used to make themselves feel better about breaking promises to kids. By the time I turned 15, I'd lived in 9 different homes and attended 6 different schools. I'd celebrated 7 birthdays where nobody sang. I'd spent 7 Christmases watching other kids open presents from their real families while I got generic gifts from donation drives, things still in their original packaging that smelled like pity and obligation. And through it all, I'd been searching. Not for my father, I'd learned that lesson, but for some proof that I'd mattered once, that I'd been loved before I'd been discarded. Some evidence that Catherine Brennan had been real and valuable and worth keeping. I was about to find that evidence, and it was going to destroy me. There was a tree outside Lincoln Heights Youth Center, an old oak with branches that reached my 3rd-floor window if you leaned out far enough. On nights when the fluorescent lights and concrete walls felt like they were suffocating me, I'd climb onto the windowsill and sit with my back against the frame, legs dangling into my room, face tilted toward stars I could barely see through the light pollution. And I'd hold a rabbit, 15 years old, and still carrying a stuffed animal like a child. Shanice had stopped mocking me about it after she caught me one night, sitting in that window talking to it. She pretended she hadn't seen, had made some noise in the hallway before coming into our shared room, giving me time to wipe my face and compose myself. After that, she'd never mentioned the rabbit again. That's how you knew someone in the system really cared about you. They learned which wounds not to touch. The rabbit's fabric had worn thin in places where my fingers always gripped it. The left ear hung by a few threads. The name tag inside was barely legible anymore, the ink faded from years of my thumb rubbing across it like a talisman. Catherine, written in the careful block letters of a 6-year-old who was just learning cursive, who had probably been so proud of writing her own name. I developed a ritual with it. Every night before bed, no matter which temporary room I was sleeping in, I'd hold the rabbit against my chest and remember things. I'd force myself to remember my father's laugh, the sound of it, the way his shoulders would shake. I'd remember the creek where we'd gone fishing, the exact shade of green the water had been, the smell of mud and algae. I'd remember my mother's hands, the way she'd braid my hair before school, the gentleness of her fingers against my scalp. I'd remember the workshop, the birdhouses, the feel of sandpaper against wood. I'd remember the pancakes, the shape of them, the taste of maple syrup. I'd remember everything I could before the memories faded completely before foster care erased Catherine Brennan and turned me into just another case file number cycling through the system. The rabbit was my evidence. As long as I had it, as long as that name tag existed with my handwriting on it, I could prove I'd been real once. I'd had a family once. I'd been loved once. Some nights I'd make up stories about why my father had left it behind when he dropped me off. Maybe he'd meant to keep it as a reminder of me. Maybe he'd looked at it and couldn't bear the guilt. Maybe he'd thrown it away and some kind soul had retrieved it, had donated it, had sent it on a journey that would eventually bring it back to me. I'd needed those stories. I'd needed to believe the rabbit had found me for a reason, that some cosmic force had understood I needed proof of my own existence. At Lincoln Heights, we had a life skills class every Thursday where a burned-out social worker named Mr. Peterson would teach us things the system thought we needed to know. How to fill out job applications. How to open a bank account. How to apply for food stamps. How to survive in a world that had already decided we were disposable. One Thursday, he brought in a lawyer who volunteered with foster youth, a woman named Ms. Ramirez who wore expensive suits and spoke with the kind of authority that came from people actually listening to her. She talked about our rights, about how to request our case files, about how to search for biological family if we wanted to reconnect when we aged out of the system. After class, I'd approached her. My hands had been shaking, the rabbit tucked under my arm. I'd asked her how someone could find their parents if they'd been abandoned, if they disappeared. She'd looked at me with the same expression everyone eventually wore when they dealt with foster kids. Compassion mixed with the knowledge that most of our stories didn't have happy endings. She told me to start with county records, with birth certificates, with any documentation I could find. I'd asked if she could help me. She'd given me her card, told me to call her when I turned 16, when I'd have more legal standing to request information. That night, sitting in my window with the rabbit, I'd made a decision. I was going to find them. I was going to find my father and my mother, and I was going to ask them why. Why they'd left me. Why they'd signed papers erasing me from their lives. Why I hadn't been worth fighting for. I was going to show them I'd survived. That I'd kept this rabbit, kept my name, kept myself alive despite everything they'd done. I was going to prove that you couldn't just throw away a daughter and expect her to disappear forever. The rabbit's missing button and I stared at me from my lap, and I'd sworn to it, to myself, to the ghost of Catherine Brennan who'd written her name inside its ear. I will find the truth. I will understand what happened. I will prove I existed. 3 weeks later, I'd find that truth, and it would teach me that some questions are more merciful left unanswered. The Wayne County Records Office was a gray building that smelled like old paper and bureaucracy. I'd taken 2 buses to get there on a Saturday morning in November, 3 days after my 16th birthday. Ms. Ramirez's card clutched in my sweating palm like a permission slip to my own past. The woman behind the counter had looked at me over her glasses when I'd asked for my birth certificate, had asked for identification I didn't have, had sighed like I was personally ruining her day. Ms. Ramirez had prepared me for this. She coached me on what to say, how to request my file as a foster youth, which forms to fill out. The woman had disappeared into a back room for 20 minutes while I'd sat in a plastic chair picking at my cuticles until they bled. When she'd returned, she'd handed me a manila envelope with my case number written across it in red ink. I'd opened it right there in the waiting area, my hands shaking so badly the papers rattled. Birth certificate first. Catherine Marie Brennan, born June 3rd, 1989, Riverside Community Hospital, 7 pounds 4 ounces. Mother, Jennifer Brennan. Father, Richard Brennan. Proof I'd existed, right there in official print. Then the relinquishment papers my mother had signed. The formal language making it sound clean and legal. Voluntary surrender of parental rights. Best interest of the minor child. Signed and dated March 15, 1997. 8 years old. The exact day he'd left me at the group home. And then at the bottom of the stack, a document I hadn't been prepared for. A death certificate. My death certificate. Catherine Marie Brennan. Date of death, September 22nd, 2004. Cause, accidental drowning. Place, Millers Creek, Ohio. Body not recovered. Declared deceased by court order. Signed by Judge Marcus Harrison. My vision tunneled. The fluorescent lights overhead became too bright, the air too thick. I'd read it 3 times before my brain could process what my eyes were seeing. Accidental drowning. Body not recovered. I'd stood up without meaning to, the papers falling from my hands and scattering across the floor. The woman behind the counter had asked if I was all right, and I'd laughed, this high-pitched hysterical sound that didn't belong to me. I'd pointed at the papers, at the death certificate with my name on it. "I'm right here," I'd said. "I'm standing right here. How can I be dead if I'm standing right here?" She'd picked up the papers with the efficiency of someone who'd seen bureaucratic nightmares before, had looked at the birth certificate, then the death certificate, then at me. Her face had gone pale. I'd watched her walk back to her supervisor's office, watched through the glass partition as she showed him the documents, watched him pick up a phone. I hadn't waited to see who he was calling. I'd grabbed the papers and run. I'd run out of that building, and kept running until my lungs burned, until I'd collapsed on a bench at a bus stop 3 blocks away. I'd spread the death certificate on my lap with trembling fingers, studying every detail like it was a test I'd failed without knowing I was taking it. My father had reported me dead. Not missing. Not lost. Dead. He'd claimed I'd drowned in the creek where he'd taught me to fish, where we'd spent that perfect day when I was 6 and the world had made sense. He told authorities my body had been swept away, that he'd searched for days, that there was nothing left to recover. And a judge had believed him. Judge Marcus Harrison had signed this document declaring Catherine Marie Brennan deceased, had closed my file, had let my father collect life insurance money on a daughter who was breathing in a foster home 60 miles away. Does success matter more than love? I'd asked myself that question sitting on that bench, my death certificate in my hands, my very real pulse pounding in my very alive body. But I'd realized it was the wrong question. My father hadn't chosen success over love. He'd chosen convenience over truth. It was easier to report me dead than to explain why he'd abandoned me. Easier to forge a tragic accident than to admit he'd thrown away his daughter like trash. Cleaner to have a death certificate than a paper trail of child abandonment. I'd folded that certificate carefully, had put it in my backpack next to the rabbit, and I'd made another decision. If Catherine Brennan was legally dead, then she'd stay dead. I'd stop searching for parents who'd killed me on paper to make their lives easier. I'd stop hoping for some reunion that would never come. I'd stop being their ghost. That night, I'd looked at myself in the bathroom mirror at Lincoln Heights, and I'd practiced saying a new name. Kate. Just Kate. Not Catherine. That girl had drowned in Miller's Creek according to official documents. But Kate. Kate was alive. Kate was a survivor. Kate was someone who'd learned the most important lesson of all. Sometimes you have to bury your own death certificate before you can start living. Lincoln Heights had a computer lab that stayed open until 10 on weeknights for residents who needed to do homework. By 9:30, it was always empty except for the night supervisor who sat at the front desk reading romance novels and pretending to monitor our internet usage. I'd waited until everyone else had left, until it was just me and the blue glow of a monitor in a room that smelled like instant ramen and teenage desperation. The rabbit sat on the desk beside the keyboard, its one remaining eye watching me. I'd pulled up a search engine and typed my own name. Catherine Marie Brennan, Ohio. The results had loaded slowly on the ancient computer. There were 3 articles. Local girl drowns in Miller's Creek. Community mourns tragic loss. Memorial service held for Catherine Brennan. Each article told the same story my father had crafted. A family fishing trip gone wrong. A strong current. A desperate search. A grief-stricken father who'd done everything he could. There was even a photo, grainy and reproduced poorly in newsprint. My school picture from 2nd grade, the one where I'd worn a blue dress with white flowers and smiled like I believed the world was safe. The memorial service had been held at Riverside Methodist Church. 43 people had attended according to the article. I'd wondered if my mother had cried, if she'd worn black, if she'd stood beside my father and accepted condolences for the daughter she'd helped erase. I'd wondered if any of those 43 people had questioned why there was no body, no funeral, no grave. Or if grief made people stupid, made them accept whatever story was easiest to believe. I'd closed that window and opened a new one. If Catherine Brennan was dead, I needed to become someone else. Not just in my head, but on paper, in records, in the kind of documentation that would let me age out of the system and disappear into a life my father couldn't touch. I typed, "How to change your name as a minor." The results had been discouraging. Court orders. Parental consent. Legal fees I couldn't afford. But there've been other results too. Forums where people discussed creating new identities, stories of foster kids who'd slipped through cracks in the system, anecdotes about social security numbers and birth certificates that didn't quite match up. The system was broken. Everyone knew it. Records got lost. Files got confused. Kids fell through gaps all the time. I'd pulled out a notebook and started writing names. Girl names that felt nothing like Catherine. Sarah, Jessica, Amanda, Rachel. Each one I'd say out loud, testing how it felt in my mouth, whether it fit the person I wanted to become. They'd all felt wrong. Too soft or too common, or too much like the kind of girl who got abandoned at group homes. Then I'd written Kate. Short, strong, impossible to make cute or diminutive, a name that didn't apologize for existing. Kate Morrison. I'd found Morrison in the phone book at the library the next day, had picked it because it was common enough to be unremarkable but not so common it would raise flags. Kate Morrison. I'd practiced the signature 30 times in my notebook, finding the rhythm of it, the flow of letters that would become my new identity. The transformation happened in pieces over the next few months. A caseworker who'd filed my paperwork wrong, listing me as Kate instead of Catherine. A school enrollment form where I'd written Morrison, and nobody had questioned it because foster kids changed names all the time, took on new identities with each placement. A social security card application where the system's confusion worked in my favor, where bureaucratic errors created a paper trail for someone who shouldn't exist. By the time I turned 17, Kate Morrison had a GED, a work permit, and a future that didn't include dead girls or fathers who'd killed them for insurance money. Catherine Brennan stayed buried in Miller's Creek, right where my father had put her. That night in the computer lab, staring at my own memorial service announcement, I'd felt something crack inside me. Not breaking, but opening. Like a shell I'd been trapped in finally giving way. I'd picked up the rabbit, had looked at the name tag one last time. Catherine. That little girl who believed in pancakes and fishing trips, and fathers who kept their promises. I'd kissed the top of its head, had whispered "I'm sorry you died," and had tucked it into my backpack. Kate Morrison didn't need a stuffed animal. Kate Morrison needed armor. But I'd kept it anyway, because some ghosts deserved to be remembered, even if only by the people who survived becoming them. My first apartment was a studio above a laundromat in Cleveland. Rent was $450 a month, and the place smelled perpetually like fabric softener and someone else's clean laundry. I'd moved in 3 days after aging out of the system at 18, carrying everything I owned in 2 garbage bags and a backpack. The rabbit went on the windowsill where morning light hit it, faded and worn but still keeping watch. I'd gotten a job at a call center, $8 an hour answering complaints about cable bills from people who had no idea they were talking to someone who'd been declared legally dead. I'd worked 40-hour weeks and taken night classes at community college, falling asleep over textbooks in the fluorescent glow of 24-hour diners, drinking coffee that tasted like regret and determination. My manager at the call center was a woman named Denise who'd noticed I never took sick days, never complained, showed up 15 minutes early for every shift. She pulled me aside one day during break and asked if I was running from something or toward something. Both, I told her. She'd nodded like she understood and had helped me apply for a scholarship program for former foster youth. Cleveland State University accepted me with a full ride when I was 20. I'd cried in the financial aid office when they'd handed me the acceptance letter, ugly grateful tears that embarrassed the counselor who'd processed my paperwork. Kate Morrison was going to college. Kate Morrison was going to be someone. I'd majored in business administration because it felt like armor, like learning the language of the world that had tried to erase me. I'd learned about contracts and liability and corporate structure. I'd learned how men like my father built empires on paper while destroying families in reality. I'd graduated with honors at 24 and had gotten hired at a consulting firm downtown. The rabbit moved with me to each new apartment, studio to 1-bedroom to a place with actual square footage and a kitchen where I could cook something other than ramen. It sat on my dresser through my 20s, through promotions and late nights at the office, through dates that went nowhere because I'd learned not to let anyone too close. Trust was a muscle I'd torn too many times to use properly. At 27, I'd met Diana at a networking event. She was 10 years older, sharp-suited and sharp-tongued, running her own accounting firm with the kind of confidence I was still learning to fake. We talked about tax law and asset protection, and somehow ended up closing down the hotel bar, sharing stories about broken families. She told me about her divorce and her teenage son who wouldn't speak to her. I told her I grew up in foster care, which was true enough without being the whole truth. She became my mentor, then my friend, then the closest thing I had to family. She'd never asked why I didn't have parents at holidays. Some people understood that silence was its own kind of answer. By 30, Kate Morrison had a career, a savings account, a therapist I saw twice a month who helped me understand that survival wasn't the same as healing. I'd built a life from nothing, from garbage bags and government assistance, and sheer stubborn refusal to disappear the way my father had wanted. The rabbit's fabric had grown thin enough to see the stuffing beneath. I'd sewn the ear back on 3 times. The name tag inside had faded to almost nothing, Catherine barely visible anymore, like even that ghost was finally fading. Sometimes I'd hold it late at night and wonder if this was enough. If building Kate Morrison had been worth burying Catherine Brennan. If I'd survived or just become really good at pretending. I'd changed my legal name officially when I was 32, court order and everything, making Kate Morrison as real as government documents could make a person. The judge who'd processed it had been bored, had barely looked at my paperwork, had no idea he was legally resurrecting someone who drowned in Miller's Creek decades ago. I'd walked out of that courthouse with a new birth certificate, a new social security card, a new everything. Kate Morrison, born in Cleveland, parents unknown, history sanitized. The consulting firm had promoted me to senior analyst. I'd specialized in corporate restructuring, in helping failing businesses identify what was salvageable and what needed to be cut loose. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd become an expert in knowing when to let things die. Diana had invited me to speak on a panel about women in business, about overcoming obstacles, about building success from difficult circumstances. I'd stood on that stage in a suit that cost more than a month's rent in my first apartment, and I talked about resilience without mentioning I'd been practicing it since I was 8 years old. After the panel, a woman had approached me. Late 50s, expensive jewelry, the kind of polish that came from old money. She'd handed me her card and told me her law firm handles some interesting cases, that she'd love to talk to me about consulting on a complex business fraud investigation. Corporate malfeasance, she'd said. Asset hiding, insurance fraud, that sort of thing. Her name was Patricia Chen. The case involved a man named Richard Brennan. Patricia Chen's office overlooked Lake Erie, floor-to-ceiling windows that made you feel like you were floating above the city. I'd sat in a leather chair that probably cost more than my car and listened to her explain the case against Richard Brennan. Insurance fraud spanning 20 years. Multiple claims on the same incident. Life insurance, property damage, business losses, all tied to the tragic drowning of his daughter in 2004. He collected over $300,000 across various policies, had used that money to fund a construction business that had grown into a multi-million-dollar operation. Brennan Development Corporation now owned half the commercial real estate in 3 counties. My father had built an empire on my grave. Patricia had pulled out photographs. My father at ribbon-cutting ceremonies, my father shaking hands with city council members, my father accepting awards for Businessman of the Year. He looked older, gray at the temples, expensive suit, confident smile. He looked successful. He looked like someone who'd never abandoned his 8-year-old daughter at a group home. I'd kept my face neutral, professional, had listened to Patricia explain they had evidence of the fraud but needed someone with financial expertise to trace the money, to build a paper trail that would connect the insurance payments to his current assets. She'd offered me a consulting fee that would have seemed obscene if I'd been anyone other than the daughter he'd reported dead. Is this revenge, or am I still his victim? The question had burned through my mind during that entire meeting. I'd told Patricia I needed time to think about it. That night, I'd sat in my apartment with every light off, the rabbit in my lap, staring at the city lights through my window. I'd built a good life. Kate Morrison had friends, had career stability, had a therapist who'd helped her understand that healing meant moving forward, not looking back. Taking this case meant stepping into Catherine Brennan's grave and climbing out in front of everyone. It meant admitting I'd been the girl who drowned, the ghost my father had profited from. It meant facing him. I'd picked up my phone a dozen times to call Patricia and decline. Put it down a dozen times because declining felt like letting him win again, like staying buried, like agreeing I was worth less than $300,000 and a construction empire. The rabbit's remaining I caught the streetlight from outside. I touched the faded name tag, that almost invisible Catherine, and I'd remembered something my therapist had said during our last session. You survived by becoming invisible. The question now is whether you want to stay that way. I'd pulled up my laptop and Googled Brennan Development Corporation. They had a slick website, professional photos of buildings and shopping centers, a biography page with Richard Brennan's smiling face. Devoted father, it said in the bio, overcame personal tragedy to build a legacy of community development. Devoted father. I'd laughed, this bitter sound that echoed in my empty apartment. He devoted himself right out of fatherhood and into fraud. Diana had called around midnight, probably sensing through some cosmic friendship channel that I was spiraling. I told her about the case, careful to keep my voice level, professional, like I was discussing any other consulting opportunity. She'd been quiet for a long moment before asking the question I'd been avoiding. Is Richard Brennan the reason you grew up in foster care? I'd said yes. She'd said then you already know what you need to do. But I hadn't known. Not really. Because there were two ways to look at what Patricia was offering. One way said this was justice, accountability, the universe finally giving me a chance to expose the man who'd erased me. The other way said this was pain, re-traumatization, dragging myself back into a past I'd spent 17 years escaping. I'd held the rabbit against my chest, felt my heartbeat against its worn fabric. Somewhere in Ohio, my father was sleeping in an expensive house I'd helped pay for, surrounded by success I'd helped fund, living a life built on the lie of my death. He'd never wondered if I was okay, never searched for me, never regretted what he'd done. He cashed the checks and moved on. The rabbit's missing button, I seemed to ask me a question. What does Catherine Brennan deserve? Not Kate Morrison with her consulting career and her therapy appointments and her carefully constructed life. Catherine Brennan, the little girl who'd caught a sunfish and believed her father when he'd called her his greatest creation. What did she deserve? I'd opened my laptop and typed an email to Patricia Chun. 3 words. I'll take it. Then I'd sat in the dark holding that rabbit and crying for both versions of myself. The girl who died, and the woman who was about to dig up her own grave. The courthouse doors were heavier than I'd remembered from that hallway moment, the brass handle cold enough to burn. I'd pushed them open at exactly 2:15 on October 12, 2024, 17 minutes after proceedings had begun, timed perfectly so the room would be full and settled. Patricia had coached me on this. Maximum impact required an entrance, not just testimony. The hinges creaked. Every head turned. The courtroom smelled like old wood and recycled air, that particular scent of a space where lives got decided by people in robes. My heels clicked against the marble floor, each step echoing in a silence so complete I could hear someone's watch ticking 3 rows back. The rabbit pressed against my ribs through my coat pocket, its familiar weight the only thing keeping my legs moving forward. I'd worn a navy suit, professional armor, hair pulled back severe enough to hurt. Kate Morrison, the consultant, walking in to do her job. Except my hands were shaking and my pulse was hammering in my throat, and every instinct I had was screaming to turn around and run. The prosecution table was to my left. Patricia stood, her face carefully neutral but her eyes communicating what we'd practiced. Steady. Breathe. You've got this. The defense table was to my right. 3 lawyers in expensive suits shuffling papers, looking annoyed at the interruption. And there, in the chair between them, sat my father. Richard Brennan looked up at the sound of the door, casual at first, probably expecting a late clerk or a witness he'd been briefed about. His eyes met mine. I watched the blood drain from his face in real time, watched his expression cycle through confusion, recognition, then something that might have been fear or might have been rage. His mouth opened. No sound came out. Someone in the gallery gasped. I kept walking, kept my eyes locked on his, let him see me. Not Catherine, the little girl he discarded. Kate, the woman who'd survived him. The bailiff was speaking, asking for my name for the record, but I couldn't hear him over the rushing in my ears. The judge was an older man with steel-gray hair and reading glasses perched on his nose, looking between me and the prosecution table with growing confusion. Patricia stepped forward. Your Honor, this is Kate Morrison, our financial forensics consultant. She's here to provide expert testimony regarding the asset trail in this case. The judge nodded, gestured for me to approach the witness stand. I moved past the defense table, close enough to hear my father's breathing, fast and shallow like he'd been running. Close enough to smell his cologne, the same brand he'd worn when I was a child, that scent that used to mean safety and now meant nothing but betrayal. One of his lawyers leaned over to whisper something. My father didn't respond, didn't look away from me, his face a mask of shock that would have been satisfying if my entire body wasn't vibrating with adrenaline. The witness stand was elevated, 3 steps up, a wooden chair with worn armrests. I climbed them slowly, turned to face the courtroom, placed my right hand on the Bible the bailiff offered. Through the window behind the judge, I could see clouds moving across a gray October sky. The rabbit shifted in my pocket. State your name for the record. The bailiff's voice cut through the silence. I opened my mouth. This was it. The moment where Kate Morrison and Catherine Brennan would collide in front of 50 witnesses and a court reporter and a man who thought he'd buried me 20 years ago. My name is Kate Morrison. My voice came out steady, stronger than I'd expected. I was hired by Chen and Associates to analyze the financial records in this case. The judge was writing something down. Patricia was organizing papers at her table. The gallery was full of people I didn't know, reporters probably, business associates of my father's, faces that meant nothing to me. But in my peripheral vision, I could see my father. Still staring, still frozen, still trying to understand how a ghost had walked through his courtroom door and climbed into a witness stand and said a name that wasn't the one he'd put on a death certificate. The bailiff finished swearing me in. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? I looked directly at my father when I answered. I do. And I watched him understand, in that moment, that the truth was going to cost him everything. Judge Marcus Harrison had been studying me over his reading glasses since I'd sat down, his pen frozen above his notepad, his expression shifting from professional neutrality to something else. Something like recognition trying to break through 20 years of faded memory. Patricia began her questioning, establishing my credentials, my expertise, my role in analyzing the financial documents. I answered on autopilot, my consultant voice smooth and professional, while my heart tried to punch through my ribcage. But the judge wasn't listening to my answers. He was staring at my face, his eyes narrowing, his head tilting slightly like he was trying to solve a puzzle that had suddenly appeared in his courtroom. Then I watched it happen. The moment his memory clicked into place. His face went pale. His hand gripped the edge of his bench. He leaned forward slightly, squinting, then sat back hard in his chair like someone had shoved him. Miss Chen, the judge interrupted, his voice tight. Approach the bench, please. Both counsels, Patricia and the 3 defense lawyers, moved forward, confusion evident on everyone's faces except mine and the judge's. I sat in the witness stand, hands folded in my lap, rabbit pressing against my ribs, watching my father watch me with growing panic in his eyes. The lawyers clustered at the bench, leaning in as the judge spoke in what was supposed to be a whisper, but carried in the silent courtroom. He gestured at me, his hand trembling slightly. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw Patricia's face transform from confusion to shock to something fierce and vindicated. The defense lawyers turned to look at me, then at my father, then at each other. One of them went red. Another started flipping frantically through papers. The judge sat back, ran his hand over his face, and did something I'd never seen a judge do. He turned to his clerk, a young woman with dark hair sitting below his bench with a laptop and a recorder, and he whispered loud enough for the first 3 rows to hear. She's a daughter we declared dead 20 years ago. The courtroom exploded. Not literally, but the sound of 50 people gasping and starting to talk at once felt like detonation. The reporters in the back row lunged for their phones. The bailiff stepped forward calling for order. Someone in the gallery actually stood up to get a better look at me. And my father made a sound I'd never heard from him before. A choked noise somewhere between a gasp and a sob, his hand flying to his mouth, his chair scraping back as he tried to stand, and then sat down again, hard like his legs wouldn't hold him. The judge was banging his gavel, the sharp cracks cutting through the chaos. Order! Order in this court. The room settled into a trembling silence, everyone on the edge of their seats, every eye locked on either me or the judge or my father, who looked like he was about to vomit. Judge Harrison removed his glasses, cleaned them slowly, put them back on. His hands were shaking. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Grief, maybe. Or anger at himself. Or both. "Ms. Morrison," he said carefully, "is that your legal name?" "Yes, Your Honor. I'd had it changed officially 6 years ago." He nodded slowly. "And before that, I went by the name I was given in foster care after my parents surrendered custody. And before that," his voice was barely above a whisper now, "before that, my birth name was Catherine Marie Brennan." Someone in the gallery actually screamed. One of the defense lawyers dropped his pen. The clerk's fingers had frozen over her keyboard, her mouth hanging open. The judge closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them, they were shining with something that looked like shame. "I signed your death certificate," he said, and it wasn't a question. "You did, Your Honor, in September 2004, based on a report filed by Richard Brennan, claiming his daughter had drowned in Miller's Creek and her body was not recovered." Judge Harrison looked at my father, and I'd never seen someone's face carry that much contempt. "Mr. Brennan." My father couldn't speak. He sat there, gray-faced, mouth opening and closing, his lawyers on either side trying to whisper to him while he ignored them completely. The judge turned back to me. "Ms. Morrison. Catherine." His voice cracked slightly on my name. "Where have you been for 20 years? "In foster care, Your Honor." Then aging out of the system at 18 and building a life under a different name, because, according to the state of Ohio, Catherine Brennan died in 2004, and I didn't want to be a ghost anymore. The silence in that courtroom was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. The judge's hand was pressed flat against his bench like he needed the solidity of wood to keep himself grounded. Patricia Chun resumed her questioning with the careful precision of a surgeon. "Ms. Morrison, can you walk the court through your findings regarding the insurance claims filed by Richard Brennan in 2004? I pulled the folder Patricia had prepared from the stand's shelf, opened it with steady hands that no longer shook. My consultant voice returned, clinical and detached, the armor I'd spent years building. On September 25, 2004, 3 days after Catherine Brennan was reported deceased, Richard Brennan filed a claim with Midwest Family Life Insurance for a policy taken out in 1995 when his daughter was 6 years old. Face value, $100,000. The courtroom was silent except for the scratch of the court reporter's keys and my voice cutting through it like a blade. 2 weeks later, he filed a second claim with Guardian Trust Insurance, a separate policy purchased in 1998. Face value, $75,000. Then in November 2004, he filed a claim for accidental death benefits through his business liability policy with Continental Insurance Group. That claim was for $125,000. I looked up from the papers, directly at my father. His hands were clasped on the table in front of him, knuckles white, jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle jumping. Total insurance payout within 3 months of reporting his daughter deceased, $300,000. I could hear someone in the gallery doing math, the sharp intake of breath when they reached the same number. Patricia nodded. "And what did Mr. Brennan do with that money?" I flipped to the next section, financial records I'd spent 6 weeks analyzing, following money through accounts and investments like following blood through veins. In December 2004, Richard Brennan made a down payment of $250,000 on a commercial property at 847 Industrial Parkway. He formed Brennan Development Corporation in January 2005. The initial capital investment listed in the LLC filing was $300,000. My father's lawyer stood up. "Objection, Your Honor. The source of business capital is not evidence of fraud. Plenty of entrepreneurs use life insurance payouts to fund new ventures." The judge looked at him with ice in his eyes. "Overruled. Continue, Ms. Morrison." I continued. Over the next 20 years, Brennan Development Corporation grew to control 18 commercial properties valued at over $12 million. I traced the financial growth, showing how that initial blood money had been leveraged, reinvested, multiplied. Every building he owned, every success he celebrated, every award he received for Businessman of the Year, it all traced back to September 2004. To a death certificate signed by the judge, currently presiding. To a little girl left in a group home who became a line item in a business plan. But the insurance fraud wasn't the complete picture, I said, and I felt Catherine Brennan's ghost speaking through Kate Morrison's voice. In 2006, Richard Brennan filed for an earned income tax credit claiming zero dependents. In 2008, he claimed head of household status on his tax returns with no children listed. In 2011, his company received a business expansion grant that required disclosure of family members who might benefit financially. He listed none. The defense lawyer was on his feet again. Your Honor, this is character assassination, not financial testimony. Judge Harrison didn't even look at him. Overruled. Ms. Morrison, continue. For 20 years, Richard Brennan has operated as if Catherine Brennan never existed. No tax deductions for a dependent child because he'd reported her dead. No child support obligations because, according to records, he had no living children. No inheritance considerations, no college funds, no family medical history disclosures. He erased her so completely that when she aged out of foster care at 18, the state had to create a new identity for her because Catherine Brennan was legally deceased and buried in paperwork he'd filed. I pulled out the final document, the one Patricia had gotten from county archives. This is the memorial fund Richard Brennan established in 2005. The Catherine Brennan Memorial Scholarship for Disadvantaged Youth. He donated $5,000 to it annually, taking the tax deduction every year while the actual Catherine Brennan was working 40-hour weeks at a call center to afford community college. The gallery erupted again. The judge didn't bother calling for order this time, just let the wave of outrage wash over the room. My father had his head in his hands. One of his lawyers was packing papers into a briefcase. Another was whispering urgently to him, probably telling him to take whatever plea deal was about to be offered. Patricia asked one more question. Ms. Morrison, in your professional opinion, was this fraud premeditated? I looked at my father until he lifted his head and met my eyes. He'd been crying, tears streaming down his face, but I felt nothing. No satisfaction, no vindication, just the cold assessment of an analyst reviewing data. Yes, the policies were taken out years before the alleged death, suggesting long-term planning. The timing of the claims, all within 3 months, suggests coordination. The subsequent business formation, the complete erasure from all legal documents, the memorial fund used for tax benefits while the actual child lived in poverty. All of it points to a calculated, sustained fraud that lasted 2 decades. I paused, then added what wasn't in any report. It also points to a man who valued money more than his daughter's life. The judge called a recess after my testimony. The courtroom emptied in a chaos of reporters shouting questions and spectators murmuring and lawyers huddling in urgent conferences. Patricia touched my shoulder, asked if I was okay, told me I'd done well. I nodded because words felt impossible. The bailiff directed me to a witness room down the hall, a small space with a table and 2 chairs, and a window that overlooked the parking lot. I sat there holding the rabbit, finally alone after 2 hours of being stared at by 50 strangers. The door opened 10 minutes later. I expected Patricia. Instead, my father walked in. The bailiff hovered behind him uncertainly, probably breaking protocol, probably moved by some misguided notion that we needed closure. Richard Brennan looked smaller than he had in the courtroom, older, his expensive suit hanging off his frame like it belonged to someone else. He stood just inside the door, not moving closer, his hands hanging uselessly at his sides. Katie, he said, and his voice cracked on the nickname he'd called me when I was 6, and the world had made sense. Don't. My voice came out harder than I'd intended. You don't get to call me that. He flinched, nodded. Kate, then. Ms. Morrison. I don't know what to call you. You don't call me anything. You made sure I didn't exist, remember? He moved to the chair across from me, but didn't sit, just stood there gripping the back of it like he needed something to hold on to. I didn't know you were alive. The lie hung in the air between us, so obvious it was almost funny. I watched him hear it himself, watch his face crumble as he realized he couldn't even pretend. You left me at that group home, I said quietly. You drove away while I was sitting in the lobby. You knew exactly where I was. He sat down then, heavily, like his legs had given out. His hands were shaking on the table. The business was failing. Your mother and I, we were drowning in debt. I thought if I could just get some capital, start over, I could come back for you. But you didn't come back. I waited for you. I sat by that window, every visitation day for 6 months waiting for you to come back. He was crying now, ugly tears that dripped onto the table. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Katie. Catherine. God, I don't even know who you are anymore. I pulled the rabbit from my pocket, set it on the table between us. I watched his face when he saw it, watched recognition and pain crash over him like a wave. You remember this? He nodded, reached out like he might touch it, then pulled his hand back. You'd had that since you were 3. Your grandmother gave it to you. I found it in a donation box at my 3rd foster home. Some kind soul must have saved it when you threw away everything that proved I existed. I didn't throw anything away. Your mother, she kept your room exactly how it was for years. She couldn't let go. But you could. You didn't just let go, you cashed in. $300,000. A scholarship fund in my name while I was eating cafeteria food and sleeping in group homes. He buried his face in his hands. I told myself you were better off. That the system would take care of you. That I was too broken to be your father. You were right about that last part, I said. You were too broken to be my father. But instead of getting help, instead of fighting for me, you declared me dead and built an empire on my corpse. We sat in silence for a long moment. Through the window, I could see Patricia pacing in the parking lot, on the phone, probably coordinating with the prosecution about what came next. Finally, my father looked up. His face was ravaged, red and swollen. What happens now? Now you lose everything, just like I did. Your business, your reputation, probably your freedom. You'll know what it feels like to have your identity erased, to become nothing. But here's the difference between us. I learned something from being erased. I learned to see people who feel invisible. I learned that success means nothing if you build it on someone else's grave. You just learned how to profit from pain. He nodded slowly, accepting it. Do you hate me? I considered the question, honestly. The Catherine in me wanted to say yes, wanted to rage at him for every cold night and every empty birthday and every moment I'd felt worthless. But Kate knew better. I don't hate you. I pity you. You had a daughter who loved you, who would have forgiven anything, who wanted nothing more than to be worthy of you. And you threw that away for money you didn't even need. You didn't just kill Catherine Brennan. You killed the man you could have been. I stood up, picked up the rabbit, tucked it back in my pocket. My father stood too, uncertain. I'm sorry, he said again, helplessly, like the words might mean something if he repeated them enough. I know, but sorry doesn't give me back 20 years. Sorry doesn't erase the foster homes or the nights I cried myself to sleep or the fact that I had to become someone else to survive what you did. I walked to the door, then paused. For what it's worth, I hope someday you figure out how to see people. Really see them. Before you lose everyone who ever mattered. The bailiff opened the door. I walked out without looking back. Behind me, I heard my father collapse into the chair and sob. And I felt nothing but the weight of the rabbit in my pocket and the certainty that some lessons come too late to matter. 6 months after the trial, I stood in my apartment on a Saturday morning holding the rabbit and a pair of scissors. The prosecution had gotten everything they'd wanted. My father pled guilty to insurance fraud, tax evasion, and filing false reports. He got 8 years in federal prison and was ordered to pay back every dollar, plus penalties. Brennan Development Corporation was liquidated. The building sold. The empire dismantled brick by brick, just like he dismantled me. Judge Harrison had retired early, citing the emotional weight of knowing he'd signed a death certificate for a living child. He'd written me a letter apologizing, explaining he'd trusted the wrong man, that he'd carry that mistake for the rest of his life. I'd written back telling him I forgave him because holding on to anger was like drinking poison and expecting someone else to die. But the rabbit had carried me through everything. Through testimony and trials, through reporters shouting questions, through the moment my story went viral and strangers started recognizing me in grocery stores. Through nights when the weight of being seen felt heavier than 20 years of being invisible. Diana had asked me once what I was going to do with it now that everything was over. Keep it forever, I'd said. It's proof I survived. But that morning, looking at its worn fabric and missing eye and the name tag that had faded to nothing, I'd realized something. Catherine Brennan didn't need proof anymore. She'd walked into a courtroom and spoken her truth and been believed. She'd been seen, finally, completely, by everyone who'd ever overlooked her. The rabbit had done its job. I'd cut open the seam carefully, gently, like performing surgery on a friend. Inside was the stuffing I'd expected, yellowed and compressed from decades of being carried. But there was something else too, tucked deep inside the cotton. A photograph. Faded, creased, but unmistakable. Me at 6 years old, holding a tiny sunfish, my father's arm around my shoulders, both of us grinning at the camera. The photo from Miller's Creek. The one I thought was thrown away. Someone had hidden it inside the rabbit before it was donated. My mother, probably. Unable to let go completely, unable to fight, but unable to erase me entirely. I'd held that photo and cried, not from pain but from the strange relief of knowing I'd been loved once, even by people too broken to show it properly. That afternoon, I'd driven to Riverside Community Park. There was a memorial garden there, a place where people left flowers and notes for loved ones they'd lost. I'd buried the rabbit under an oak tree with a small plaque I had made. Catherine Marie Brennan, 1989 to 2004, legally dead, forever alive, and I kept the photograph. Because remembering the good doesn't mean forgetting the bad. It means understanding that people are complicated, that love and harm can exist in the same hands, that surviving means carrying both truths without letting either one destroy you. The trial made national news. Foster care reform became a talking point. Insurance companies changed their policies on death certificates for minors. Judge Harrison's retirement sparked a conversation about judicial accountability. My father's case became a cautionary tale about the cost of choosing money over family. But for me, the real story was simpler and more universal than headlines could capture. It was about a girl who'd been told she was worthless and had spent 20 years proving everyone wrong. It was about learning that being seen isn't the same as being valued, and being valued starts with valuing yourself. It was about understanding that some people will always look away, and that's their loss, not yours. How many ghosts walk among us? That's the question I think about now. How many people are standing right in front of us, invisible, because we've decided they don't matter? How many daughters and sons are carrying stuffed animals and broken hearts, waiting for someone to finally see them? Patricia offered me a permanent position at her firm. Diana introduced me to her son, and we're slowly building something that might become friendship. My therapist says I'm doing the work, whatever that means. I think it means I'm learning to exist without apologizing for taking up space. If you're listening to this story and thinking about someone you've overlooked, someone you've made invisible, someone whose worth you've underestimated, don't wait 20 years like my father did. Don't wait until a courtroom forces you to see what you've been missing. Tell me in the comments, is there someone in your life you haven't truly seen? Someone whose silence you've mistaken for absence? And please, tell me what city you're watching from. I love knowing where my survivors are, where the people who refuse to stay buried are building their lives. Subscribe if this story made you think. Share it with someone who needs to know that being declared dead, legally or emotionally, doesn't mean you have to stay that way. Because here's what I learned carrying that rabbit for 20 years. The most powerful testimony you'll ever give is the simple act of refusing to disappear. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't destruction. It's survival. And sometimes being seen isn't about making noise. It's about standing still long enough for people to realize they've been looking through you instead of at you. Catherine Brennan drowned in Miller's Creek in 2004. But Kate Morrison learned to swim. And that's the only proof of worth that ever really mattered.